topic of biofuels is really through the land use change discussion. And it's something you'll see these two topics are really intricately tied together in a close relationship. But even more broadly than that, biofuels is something I've been interested in personally for a long time. I was just thinking before this talk that I participated in a program that Scott actually coordinates now, the Wisconsin Energy Sustainability Challenge almost 10 years ago. And the project that I had entered and we presented on had to do with biofuels then. So it's something that's been around for a while, and it's been really fun for me to see how it's evolved and the discussions have evolved around it, and the research and technology has moved forward as well. So diving right in, I always try to think of a single image that I can use that really captures the essence of our research just in one slide. And many times I find myself coming back to this one, which shows really the dynamic or the conversion between grasslands and croplands. And it's this dynamic that has such an interesting relationship. I think it's interesting because globally, grasslands are the most human impacted or human disturbed biome in the world. And worldwide, about half of our grasslands have been converted or appropriated for human agriculture. And that relationship holds true in the United States as well. So about a long time ago, much of our country was covered in grasslands prior to European settlement, but now about half of all of our grasslands have been converted to intensively cultivated agriculture. So it's this dynamic and interplay that has a lot of outcomes on our landscape and our environment and our interaction with it. So why do we really care about grasslands in the first place? Well, they really provide a number of benefits to society. So they help us purify our water, they store and sequester large amounts of carbon, and they also provide a lot of recreational opportunities, and tourism, and economic benefits. They also can be a very valuable feedstock or provide valuable forage for agricultural production. Now, on the flip side of that, croplands are also really valuable. So they're incredibly productive. Something like a field of corn is one of the most productive systems we know about, and that's why corn is so widespread today. You get so much biomass from those fields, it gives you a lot of opportunities to use it. A feedstock like corn is also incredibly versatile, so there's tons of products that you can make from something like corn or soy or other agricultural products, including industrial products, food, feed, or as we'll see and talk about a little bit today, biofuels. And what's exciting about potentially using crops for biofuels is if you can displace or replace some of those petroleum-based transportation fuels, which we would otherwise rely on, there could be some real benefits for the environment and economies and other things. That kind of question, though, about whether there is that benefit of switching out existing petroleum-based transportation fuels for biofuels is something that's really, there's still uncertainty around it, I would say. So it's very sensitive to how you perform the analysis. It's an active area of research, and it's really been an ongoing area of discussion since biofuels have really become mainstream and integrated into the transportation fuel supply. So this is just a very high-level graphic that's put out by the Nebraska Ethanol Board that sort of summarizes that hope and promise of biofuels, that there's this potential here for them to be, at least with respect to carbon, net neutral or even negative, because you're using a feedstock, corn, which grows, and all that biomass from corn, it draws CO2 out of the atmosphere. So if you're using that as your input, even throughout the production process, and eventually burn that as your fuel and release CO2 back to the atmosphere, there's this idea and a potential for there to be kind of a closed loop cycle and a potential for there to be carbon savings versus, say, digging up a fossil fuel from underground and releasing that to the atmosphere. Now, it's not necessarily clean and solved. Everything is not finalized. There's questions about, okay, what if you have extra inputs that go in? So like nitrogen fertilizer production can be very energy and carbon intensive to produce. There's also questions of, well, would this corn have been growing otherwise? So, whether you eat that corn or use it for fuel, it would have been taking CO2 out of the atmosphere anyway, either way. So do biofuels really add that extra savings or not? Regardless, around this discussion, something that came up and really where our research focuses is what happens if you change the landscape if you clear additional land to make room to grow additional biofuels. And it was about 10 years ago that there's a series of seminal papers that really said, okay, biofuels, they have this really big potential, and maybe it is this really big opportunity there, but we really need to make sure that we're including the potential impacts of land clearing. And so if you increase, say, U.S. cropland area, if you expand the area of corn and that goes into natural ecosystems either here or abroad, there could be some emissions from that, and that's something that we want to make sure we're incorporating into our analyses when we make decisions about these policies. So that's kind of the focus of a lot of how we kind of came into this picture of looking at biofuels and why they're exciting and why they're important. So with that as sort of background, goals for today, I just have 3 things that I'm sort of planning on covering, and I hope we can take away. One is we'll just discuss broad recent trends in U.S. agricultural land use. So not just related to biofuels, not just to those feedstocks, but what's happening on the landscape today. If you walk out in your neighbor's farm field or drive out to the middle of the Great Plains, what would you expect to see happening on the landscape? Second, then, is bringing it back to that topic of biofuels. What is the connection of this broader agricultural land use to ethanol production and biofuel policies, and how do those interact? Excuse me. And lastly, and this is the part I get most excited about, is really thinking about opportunities to build upon some of the initial work that's been done and find ways to improve the sustainability or find new solutions to help reduce the land impacts and overall environmental impacts of biofuels. So we'll look at opportunities to do that both with policy and then looking forward at where some of the technology is going and some of the hopes for that type of research as far as reducing the land and environmental impacts of biofuels. So that's our goals, 3 of them. As a big picture step back, I always like to frame things and say, I really think we've entered into a new era of agriculture in the United States. So over the last decade or so, there's been some real fundamental changes to our agricultural markets and the landscape. So one that's maybe most obvious related to biofuels is a big shift in the use of our crops and what we produce is getting used for and applied to. So since maybe the early 2000s, the share of corn that we produce that gets used for ethanol has really gone up from below 10% to now, around 40% of corn that is grown first goes to an ethanol refinery. The amount that actually gets used, if you do like the mass balance, is a little bit less because you recover some of the byproduct and use that for animal feed. So it's really more like a quarter to a third of corn gets used for ethanol. And soybeans, a little bit less gets used for biofuels, but significant amounts of soybean oil going to soy biodiesel as well. So we have this increased demand for biofuels, which is really this entirely new demand that's been placed on our agricultural systems over the last 10 years. There's also been large changes to agricultural policy. So even unrelated to biofuels, in the 2008 Farm Bill and in the 2014 Farm Bill, there's some large restructuring to farm subsidies and farm programs. So shifts away from things like direct payments where they just pay farmers to grow an acre of a single crop to more crop insurance based and other kind of revenue insurance type programs. So some real shifts in just how agriculture has been done across the country. And then one that is maybe a little lesser known that I didn't really even know about when I started looking into this is there's been real fundamental changes to the structure of commodity markets. So in the last 10 years or so, changes in the way stock markets and grains are traded, such that there's been an increased tying or coupling of crop markets to other commodity markets like energy markets and futures. And so all that has combined to sort of create, at one point, a perfect storm where there's this almost wholesale shift in some of the trends that we've been seeing in our agricultural landscapes over the last 30 years. So with all these changes going on, we just wanted to really figure out what does this mean for the landscape? What is happening? Is everything just the same, or are there truly these shifts that maybe people would expect given all the surrounding atmosphere and environment changes? So we wanted to look across the United States to figure out where land conversions were happening. In our initial study, we looked at this time period from 2008 to 2012, which came right after a change in the Farm Bill in 2008 and also a change in some energy policy with the renewable fuel standard, which I'll touch on a little bit later. We wanted to know where changes were happening across the country and what crops were being planted. Also, what types of land were being converted to and from crop production. we're interested really in the trade-offs that are associated with this. We want to know, okay, if you convert land to crop production, how much more yields do you get on that land? What are the benefits from increasing that area under cultivation? And what are the trade-offs of that? So what are the resulting impacts on carbon sequestration rates and water use and water quality? So that was all sort of the motivation, and there had been some good regional research done ahead of us. So people had seen these regional pockets where there's been hot spots of land use change. But really, cropland dynamics hadn't been real comprehensively assessed at the national scale. So we sort of set out to ask and answer that question. And the nice thing about looking at land use across the entire country, coast to coast, from the Gulf to Canada, across the US, is you can really assess things at that scale that's appropriate for national level and federal level policy. So we've gotten some interesting insights to that as well. Before I jump and just show what we found on the landscape and the results, just a very brief overview of the methods. So to monitor land use change at such a broad scale across the entire country, satellite-based data really provides one of the best opportunities, and we try to integrate that with as much ground level and other supplementary data as possible. And for much of this study, we triangulated between a few different satellite sources coming from the USDA to look at specific crops, from the USGS and others, and in some cases going all the way back to the early 1970s, the satellite time record, to really understand what that long-term history of land use was before land conversion occurred. So we did lots of geospatial processing to really try to account for all the different things that could be happening between different crops and rotations. And we tracked both net and gross changes, which you can think of as just like finances. So you have a net change as sort of the end result or impact, where maybe cropland increased by say 1 million acres, but within that net change, there could have been 2 million acres of cropland expansion with 1 million acres of cropland loss somewhere else that offsets it. So you have these gross changes in both directions, resulting in a net final impact. And some of the stuff that I'll show is really the first nationwide assessment that gave us some of the insights to the field level crop-specific dynamics that were happening on the landscape. So what did we see? Well, we found that between 2008 and 2012, over 7 million acres of land were converted to crop production across the United States. So much of this, shown in red, is where you have crop expansion, was in hotspots like North and South Dakota, or southern Iowa and northern Missouri. And then in places like western Kansas and the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas, you had real concentrated hotspots of conversion, both to and from cropland. So lots of changes going on the landscape. The numbers down here kind of emphasize the overall amount of the landscape that was affected. So we had 7 million acres of crop expansion, at the same time about 4 million acres of crop abandonment, or land that was in crop production being put back into grasses or other uses other than active crop production. So the total area here, almost 12 million acres that were affected on the ground, is about 4 times bigger than what you would expect if you just looked at this bottom line. And that's oftentimes what is used in policymaking or what's reported by the USDA in their types of censuses and surveys that they perform on an annual basis. So we saw, wow, there really is quite a bit happening out there on the landscape that's important to take into consideration when you're trying to get the big picture. We also saw that croplands are moving into what we call new frontiers, essentially just places where crops haven't traditionally been grown before in the US. So this map shows relative cropland expansion, or the amount of new croplands, relative to how much cropland was on the landscape at the start of our study. So areas in red and circled here in orange are places where the amount of cropland more than doubled over our 4-year study period. So you can see crops are moving into new places like the perimeters of the Appalachians and Ozarks, even something like the Minnesota and Wisconsin North Woods, and then what was a little more expected, moving a little bit more westward across the Great Plains, shifting into these new areas. We wanted to know what type of ecosystems were being replaced, and we saw that really grasslands were the primary source of new croplands in the United States. So about 80% of all new crop production came from lands that were previously grassland cover. Other chunks came from shrubland and long-term idle locations, and then small but significant pieces of forest and even wetlands that were being converted to expanding crop production. looking more closely at the types of land and specifically the types of grasslands that were converted, we saw about a quarter, 27%, were what we could identify as long-term unimproved grasslands, which is a little bit of a hard thing to unpack, but it's essentially areas that you could think of as being extensive rangeland or even native prairie. So these are places that haven't been irrigated or planted for at least 20 years, we saw. And the total area of unimproved grassland conversion was 1.6 million acres nationwide, which maybe that doesn't mean a lot, but to put it in perspective, that's equal in size to the state of Delaware. So we're really seeing wholesale transformations of the landscape at broad scales converting to crop production. Looking at forest, there's a much smaller area of forest conversion, as I mentioned, just 2 or 3%. And most of this was in the eastern US, so in places like Minnesota or down in Kentucky, and a lot of that's happening in like field margins or the removal of fence rows or former woodland plots. Wetland conversion, similarly a small but significant amount. And a lot of the wetland conversion happened in a region known as the prairie potholes. So the prairie pothole region is this 5-6 state area up in, concentrated really around the Dakotas and Minnesota, where you have all this interesting matrix of tiny little ponds and wetlands across the landscape that fluctuate seasonally. And we see a lot of conversion, both of those areas and the surrounding grasslands around them. And it's ecologically significant because the prairie potholes are one of the key waterfowl breeding habitats for North America. So a lot of people, look at this and say, okay, that's a focus area, maybe something we want to look closer at. The other side of the equation, when land gets converted, we want to go, okay, what crops will really drive this change? And so you can see it's a pretty good distribution. Corn and soybeans and wheat each made up about 1/4 of the crops that were planted on newly converted land newly converted to crop production. And then alfalfa, cotton, sorghum, and some other ones made up the remainder. And we really saw that this breakout crop, or the first crop that was planted, varied spatially across the United States. So here we're showing in yellow is corn and in green is soybeans. And really corn and soybeans, unsurprisingly, dominated much of the corn belt in the existing agricultural region. So as you'd expect, those were the major crops planted on new land. But as you move west more across the country, wheat, shown here in brown, becomes a much more important breakout crop with spring wheat in the north and winter wheat in the south. And then in red, we have cotton, and in orange, sorghum. So that was kind of the broad picture of what we saw happening in the landscape for all crops, for all applications, and just agriculture in general. How does that relate to biofuels? What percent of this might be connected in some way? And really, when you think about it and look at it, biofuels can affect the landscape and land use change in 2 main pathways. So one is sort of this more global or universal impact. So if you take something like the RFS, or the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is kind of representative of biofuel policies in general. So this is the federal policy that essentially mandates how much biofuels the U.S. will produce and consume each year. So if you look at that as the main driver of biofuels on the landscape, that can affect both this universal price, so what the kind of general level is for different commodity crops across the country, which then will impact farmers to say grow more or less of a given crop compared to other ones. And it can also have local impacts. So you can imagine if somebody put in a ethanol refinery on a landscape, that would help say maybe boost prices locally right around there, or help guarantee a market, which could also have impacts on the landscape. And so it's those 2 mechanisms that really come together to tie these 2 topics of land use and biofuels together. So looking first at the big picture, at the global one, there's been a lot of economic research to try to figure out, okay, how much impact do biofuels really have? For both better and worse. They're certainly stimulating the economy and economic farm production, and you can see that really shown here. So the black line on each of these is the actual price of corn for futures and cash price, which are 2 commonly used metrics. And you can see the actual price of those for the last few years in black. And then ran alternative scenarios, these economists, to say, okay, what would have happened if there wasn't a biofuels mandate, which is shown in green. And then taking a step farther, because some other previous work really didn't separate this, change in demand that you have for biofuels with other drivers that are already there and causing changes, like weather. So in 2012, we had a huge drought. Other changes in demand, like foreign countries increasing need for feeds, crops, and things like that. So when you put all that together and average it out, it turns out the renewable fuel standard increases corn prices by about 30% per year over this time period. So using that estimate of 30%, you can do just a very, very rough back-of-the-envelope calculation using other econometric estimates, particularly to say what is the response of cultivated area for every dollar increase in the price of corn, how much does the area of corn increase, multiply that by the total cropland across the entire country, and you come up with an estimate of, okay, maybe if you had to ballpark it and just guess, you'd say, about maybe the renewable fuel standard and biofuels mandate increased cropland by about 2 million acres across the country. So, it's not responsible for all the change, for sure. It's one piece of a very large puzzle. And this is just a first estimate, and folks are now working on refining that to really get a more explicit refinement of where and how much change may have occurred from these policies. That's the big picture one. Then the local impact, how does it connect? Well, we also see there's this correlation between where land conversion is happening and where existing ethanol refineries are. So this just shows that connection. And essentially, when you have greater proximity to an ethanol refinery here, so shown in different bins of radiuses of 0 to 25 miles, when you're really close to an ethanol refinery, the probability of converting from non-cropland to cropland is much higher. And as you go further away from existing ethanol refinery, your likelihood of converting to cropland decreases. On the flip side, abandonment is more likely as you get farther away. So if you have existing crop fields, sometimes farmers take them out of production and will enroll them into conservation programs. The likelihood of that land being pulled out of production is smaller the closer you are to an ethanol refinery, and gets bigger as you move along, which is maybe what you would expect to see. It's that local impact of production facilities. And we see that really across different land uses. So these four subgraphs just show the likelihood of grassland to cropland production, of crops and forest, of crops and shrubland, and crops and wetland. And you really see these same trends across the board, where the closer you are to a refinery, the less likely, or the more likely you are to convert to cropland, the less likely you are to go to other uses. So again, just kind of a first step to understand that correlation, but there is you see that mechanism for potential connection between the uses. We also saw that when land gets converted, it's more likely to go to corn or soy, which are these major feedstock crops, the closer you are to an ethanol refinery. So within 50 miles, the majority of land that was converted to crop production did go into corn and soy, and controlling for land factors and other things like that. As you move farther away, more land then goes into other applications like small grains, wheat, alfalfa, and other types of crops. So that's sort of the big picture of what's been happening in the landscape, maybe how it connects to some of these first generation older approaches to biofuels like corn ethanol. What does that mean for potential impacts? Well, we know that when croplands expand, we're seeing that they're increasingly moving on to less suitable locations. So existing cropland, if you looked at all land that was growing a crop in 2008, most of it was on really good agricultural land, what we could call prime agricultural land. And just about 40% of it was on things that were a little more marginal, so had a few more restrictions and limitations to cultivation. New cropland, though, as you expand, so as we continue to try to grow out our cropland area, we're increasingly moving into less productive areas. So more land was considered marginal by definitions of the USDA, and the amount of croplands planted on areas that were just deemed unsuitable or really poorly suited to production doubled from existing crop extent. So you can kind of expect diminished returns, essentially, as you continue to expand cropland. So it really puts this focus of saying, okay, maybe we don't want to be expanding our crop area, but instead, what can we get from our existing crop extent, and what are opportunities to better use those other lands? That's on the soil side. The one other thing I'll just briefly mention is sort of the emissions. So going back to that question about, okay, what is the carbon savings of biofuels? So this was that, generalized sort of idea of a potential life cycle analysis of biofuels. And again, the thing that we know is missing from here is what are the emissions from land use change? And so you can do an accounting. You can essentially say, okay, where has land converted on the landscape? So we have these satellite images of all the fields that are converted. And you can essentially just sum those up. So you can say, okay, how much above ground biomass was there? How much, that's essentially your biomass in trees or in grasses. Below ground biomass, similarly, is the living plant matter in your roots of those ecosystems. And then how much soil organic carbon is there? How much carbon is locked up and stored in the soil underground? And when you convert these locations, what are the resulting emissions from that conversion? So this is all work that's led by Seth Spawn, a grad student in our research lab. He essentially did that for every pixel, for every field across the country, and said, if you were to plow this up, here's what the emissions would be. And based on where we saw locations get plowed up in the recent past, here's where carbon emissions were greatest from that recent land use change. So here, areas in red have higher overall emissions. And you can see really kind of around the outskirts of this core Corn Belt area is where emissions are the highest. You have both a lot of conversion to cropland, and in some cases, relatively high carbon stores. Interesting, what we saw though, big picture, the overall impact of carbon emissions from land use change is significant. So it's a piece that's sometimes missing from the puzzle, but across the country and whole per year, we saw about 30 million metric tons of carbon emissions, which is equivalent to an additional 6 coal-fired power plants per year, or an additional 20 million cars on the road. So really this huge component, which oftentimes will be what will push something like corn ethanol as kind of biofuel that's, just marginally better maybe than petroleum-based fuels. It will be the determinant of how much or whether it's a net positive or net negative carbon savings. So it has a really big influence on that. You can then split that up. So all these locations by crop, because crops are grown in different regions, which have different average carbon stocks and different annual emissions. The interesting thing here, this just looks at the different crops, but really the different colors, you can see most of the emissions from land use change came from soil organic carbon. So the light green and the dark green look at emissions from decomposing or the lost above and below ground biomass, plant matter. But really in brown here, we see the largest chunk of emissions from land use change are coming from that carbon that was previously stored and locked up in the soil. And it's that disturbance then that is causing a lot of the emissions. And that's really a reason why some of these new technologies like no-till or conservation agriculture hold huge promise to help improve the sustainability of crop production across the country. So if we put these kind of concepts together of, okay, we know there are land use changes associated with cropland expansion, there's carbon emissions with that, but we know that biofuels have a potential savings because you're displacing some petroleum emissions that you would otherwise have. Where does that balance come to play out? So if you look at it, this is just kind of conceptually graphing it out. You say, okay, if we're to expand into a natural ecosystem to increase our cropland area to grow a biofuel, we're going to incur this initial carbon debt because we know it releases a bunch of carbon from the soil and the biomass when we first convert it. But each year we have some savings. So we're displacing with that, we're going to grow a crop there. That crop is going to yield some things that we can convert to a fuel, and that's going to displace some petroleum. We're going to have some savings each year. And so you can essentially add up the amount of that total initial debt and then the amount of your annual savings to say how long until it becomes, breaks even or you pay back the initial carbon debt. So you can calculate the carbon payback time for different feedstocks, different crops in different locations across the country. So that's what's done here, and we've seen, might be a little hard to read, essentially the median, what we found, carbon payback time. So this is for a biofuel made from corn produced on newly cleared land. So if you expanded crop area to grow more crops for biofuels, it would take about, I think, 58 or 64 years to pay that back to make it up. So it's a long time. So that's why we want to avoid expanding onto new lands to grow crops for feedstocks and instead try to really, if you do it on existing lands. You can also see it varies a lot across the country. So areas like Iowa and Nebraska, the core agricultural regions right now, they have really high yields, so you get a lot when you produce on it, and they have average or relatively low emissions. Whereas somewhere like western South Dakota, you don't get as much bang for your buck when you plow up in a grassland and plant a crop on it, and you also have in some cases high emissions. So the carbon payback time for expanding something there will be much higher than other regions. And you can do that for different crops and different feedstocks. Okay, so that's some of the overall trends that we've been seeing on the landscape, as well as some of the initial environmental impacts, particularly related to carbon. What about policy? So I want to touch just a little bit here on the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is this fun, huge piece of legislation which governs really biofuel production and use across the country right now. And so the Renewable Fuel Standard actually operates as a mandate. So it requires that a certain level of specific biofuels be produced and blended into the U.S. transportation fuel supply. Now, what I think is really interesting and where I get excited about the Renewable Fuel Standard is that it actually has some really good conservation provisions built into it, or some language trying to improve the sustainability of biofuels and reduce those land conversion impacts. So particularly when they wrote the legislation, and it was passed back in December 2007, they said, you know what? We don't want to be causing this land conversion. We know there's severe negative environmental outcomes if we plow up new lands for crop production. We want to say, in order to be eligible for renewable feedstock production, crops have to be grown on land that was already cleared or cultivated and in production prior to the date of enactment. So that's really good. Seemingly that would help prevent some of this conversion of new land to crop production. Now, that's a really big task to implement across the country. And so the EPA was charged with responsibility for enforcing the RFS because it's a part of the Clean Air Act. And in 2010, they finalized the ruling of how they were going to put this policy into play. They came up with an approach called aggregate compliance. So aggregate compliance is an interesting beast because it's a beast of a policy to try to implement. But essentially it says, if the U.S. stays under a baseline of total cropland area, then we're going to deem everything, all land across the U.S. compliant. So in aggregate, we're going to say all U.S. croplands are compliant. That's aggregate compliance. And it was made under some pretty reasonable assumptions, perhaps at the time. Really, they thought, okay, you know what, this policy, people aren't going to be plowing up new fields to plant crops. It's just not economical. It won't happen. And at that time, that may have seemed feasible, but what we've seen in our research is, in fact, a relatively large transformation of the landscape. And so the problems there then lie with that existing approach is this aggregate compliance or enforcement mechanism really misses all those fine-scale dynamics that we've seen. So it misses that conversion to and from cropland back and forth. And you can have a cropland loss in one area where land was, say, converted to urban areas or a city, and that could be offset or kind of mask cropland expansion in another area because the total net result is going to stay the same. So there's some issues, I think, with this aggregate compliance mechanism, but I really think in general this RFS policy could be used as a tool to help improve conservation and actually prevent additional land conversion rather than right now it seems to be sort of permitting it. And people have recognized that. So policymakers are actively proposing reform or revisions to this policy. So there's legislative actions being proposed. Just last month in March, some people put forth, some senators, an act called the Greener Fuels Act, which would try to fix some of these potential limitations of aggregate compliance and other aspects. There's been any number of proposals, as well as administrative revisions being considered by the president and the EPA and things of that nature. So it's a really hot topic. People are aware that there's great opportunities here, but also some shortcomings perhaps with the existing framework. And so it's an active area of discussion that continues moving forward. The other big opportunity that I think moving forwards is really all I've been talking about so far has been just about general land use in the U.S. and most of that relevance for biofuels is with relationship to what you could call existing first generation biofuels or the production of ethanol from food crops or something like corn. So it's using typically the starch of corn kernels and refining that into ethanol. It's one of the easier ways. It's been around for a while. And really there's been a big shift and a push towards these next generation technologies that move away from using feed crops and food crops where you have this competition to using other parts of the plant and other types of crops and refining those into better biofuels or into other products that could replace petrochemicals. And so just a general idea here, you can use any number of lignocellulosic feedstocks, and it's essentially using, instead of that starch or in the case of biodiesel, the oil, using instead the lignin and cellulose that make up the cell walls and other components of those plants, and either burning them to get heat and energy that way, or using the cellulose to refine that into sugars and other products that can then be further refined into advanced biofuels or other bioproducts. And so this is all a part of really some of the exciting work going on here in GLBRC in this building. Much of it's happening here in Michigan State. And the focus, I'd say, of this next round of this GLBRC is looking at cellulosic feedstocks grown on marginal lands. So can you produce biofuels in a way that doesn't rely on these primary parts of the plant that can be used for food and feed, and also be grown in locations that will help reduce that competition with food and other crops. And so that's really the main focus, and I think an exciting area moving forward where there's big opportunity. So the GLBRC, the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, is part of this broader Department of Energy initiative of 4 research centers, I think, across the entire country, with a vision and really a goal of developing these biological solutions for, you'll see, specialty biofuels and bioproducts from plants. So shifting away from something like corn ethanol and saying, okay, how can we use non-food crops to create fuels for specific applications other than ethanol, maybe like jet fuel or other applications, or replace existing petroleum-derived chemicals in industrial applications. So it's these specialty value-added type products. And that's sort of the goal of that DOE envisions for the broader bioenergy research centers. And here at GLBRC, the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, there's a real focus on dedicated energy crops grown on marginal lands. So some other of the research centers may focus on algae or something that's biofuel, or wood products. Really the focus of the GLBRC is saying, what can we do on these marginal lands that, it's still a land-based product, but it can help reduce that competition with food and feed crops, and also growing it on existing non-agricultural areas. So how do you do that? Well, GLBRC has been around for 10 years with a lot of focus. It is just moving forwards now in its next 5 years of research. And really a big focus throughout it is modeling and looking across the entire supply chain to understand and make sure we're doing it in the best way possible. So performing integrated multi-level modeling to understand what those opportunities and impacts are if you, say, convert some land to a specific feedstock production. Is it going to be economically viable and beneficial for the farmers? How can you perhaps improve their performance and bottom line if you were to take, say, a low spot of your field that floods every other year, or a spot that gets really prone to drought? Maybe those are locations that we could say, oh, maybe that's not the best spots we've grown corn, but we could grow switchgrass or some other type of cellulosic product there that could have some real applications, like for biofuels and other industrial products, and also have some economic benefits for the producers as well. So taking really a conscientious approach to biofuels, it's great because you can really learn from and integrate all these findings from the first generations and the first rounds of a lot of bioenergy research. So as one first step approaching this, you need to first identify where these marginal lands or potential lands could be where you could produce crops with fewer production, and then which crops could go there. And so for the current GLBRC, the focus is really looking at 4 different feedstocks that would provide a variety of different input types. One is mixed species grass. We'll also be looking at if you have a variety of plant species like a native prairie, how can you use that variety and that biodiversity actually as a benefit and harvest that for a potential bioproduct? Other ones are switchgrass, sorghum, which is an annual crop similar to corn, but a little bit more drought tolerant, so it has some benefits, or poplar, a woody species. And this is a very big project, which goes well beyond my knowledge and research. But you can really see it goes across the supply chain. So people looking at where on the landscape can we be putting these kind of crops? What is the optimal way to integrate that from farmer to field to end product? And what are the environmental outcomes of that? And how do you improve those end products and the conversion to something valuable? One little component of that, as I mentioned, is just trying to understand where some of these products might go on the landscape, and that's how it kind of ties back to the land use. So a first step is what we're working on is developing a marginal lands atlas to say, okay, if we take the U.S. and we really take a step back and integrate all these goals and desired outcomes and our learnings from before, where could we put these types of cellulosic biofuel crops on the landscape? And that'll really help us identify and quantify the trade-offs and the benefits of putting them there. So we're coming up with a number of scenarios. This is just very, very early work that's getting spun up right now. We're trying to understand what those trade-offs are on the landscape so we can maximize the benefits and outcomes. Lastly, just some other opportunities for biofuels beyond these cellulosic ones. Looking at utilizing kind of a connection underutilized land. So there's a lot of spots across the country where maybe we're growing crops right now, or we could be and we aren't. So if you think of something like a center pivot irrigated field, so if you go out to Kansas or Nebraska, you see these big irrigated fields with a well in the middle and a big sprinkler system in a huge circle. A lot of times the areas on the outsides of these fields either aren't in a crop or aren't in a very high value crop, and so those could be locations where you could imagine or envision growing a cellulosic feedstock where you're gaining an extra benefit without much impact. Also looking at areas that are recently or potentially could become abandoned in the future. So as we see continued shifts in climate and growing regions and zones suitable for specific crops, as say one region becomes unsuitable for a current crop, maybe it becomes a candidate where you can replace it with one of these next generation feedstocks that's a little bit more resistant to drought or doesn't require as many environmental inputs. And lastly, this kind of touches on a whole nother world, but people are making biofuels from waste. They're making them from crop residues, but also from other waste products and other things, so landfill gases and food waste and any number of different types of sources to generate biofuels and liquid transportation fuels. So I think that's it. Conclusions. We saw really in the U.S. a pretty big change in the last 10 years. So it's been a shift from what we saw, in the last 30 years prior to that. With croplands are starting to expand again. Our research we've been updating from the most recent year, and we still do see quite a bit of conversion on the landscape. So it's not to the high extent that we saw back in 08 to 12 when crop prices were really peaked and had a ton of conversion, but there is still quite a bit of change happening on the ground. And we saw that if converted land is used for biofuels, well, then we know there's really big trade-offs. So that's probably one of the things that if you're going to look at how to do a biofuel well, you want to avoid plowing up new natural ecosystems to plant them. And lastly, drawing from that, we see huge opportunities to really improve then the sustainability of both our existing biofuels under current frameworks and policies like the Renewable Fuel Standard, where you can really try to help prevent some of this conversion, both for fuels, but it could also prevent conversion driven by any number of factors, which could be a big gain. And then moving towards these next generation products and research that can help reduce the competition between feed and food crops. So that's it. Happy to take questions or anything else. Yes.
I really appreciate the amount of data that was in this presentation. I'm curious, it's really exciting that you're looking at marginal lands and trying to figure out how to take advantage of them, but how does that fit into this overall, the aggregate value model that the RFS serve demands? Are you also looking at what lands will come out of cropland in order to counterbalance what is going to be put into cropland with the use of marginal lands?
Yeah, good question. So the question was about aggregate compliance and how marginal lands and cellulosics might sort of fit into that. I mean, it's not really clear because most of that enforcement talk has been around the first generation biofuel, so conversion for corn ethanol, where you're really transforming the landscape. So I'm not certain how they would possibly implement if you harvested like existing vegetation from a grassy field that wasn't in production before. I don't think that's actually been made clear or established yet. So it's maybe an opportunity to still define it.
So the EPA's regulation only is referencing for corn ethanol, it's only about corn cropland?
Well, let me think. So they have these, right now the RFS splits up different categories or bins of biofuels, right, like advanced, and they all have to meet different greenhouse gas reduction requirements. And they then approve for different, like advanced biofuels, they approve specific pathways. Like they'll say, okay, making landfill gas biofuel from this plant in California meets the required greenhouse gas reductions. And I think the ARB compliance is only for crop-based biofuels, which I believe then would only be probably for meeting the standard or conventional biofuels. That's a good question. I haven't really thought all the way through it. So I think about it. Look into it,
Okay.
Because most of those advanced biofuels and like cellulosics each have individually approved pathways.
Right, but they still factor in the feedstock, like whatever's been assessed to the feedstock, right? So depending on what your feedstock is going into whatever approved pathway, it's that combination of things that is the final sort of evaluation for each technology,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not a clear answer on it, but yeah, it's a good thing to think about.
So I have a quick question. Your data was 08 to 12 primarily. Did this really coincide with the RFS and E10 mandate? Primarily because we're actually developing and actually starting to build ag waste byproduct plant in North Dakota that's going to utilize sugar beet byproducts and potato byproducts to produce a very low ARB CI score based in California, and also is going to have a D5 and D3 RIN associated with that. So there's lots more activity in that space, and it would be kind of interesting to see post 2012 data. I noticed that was the kind of the run up of the build up for the D6 RIN plants, right?
Sure.
So do you have that data, or is it?
Yeah, so everything I showed was pretty much results for 08 to 12, but we're just finishing up analyses through 2016 growing season. The amount of conversion is much less, I would say, but still, substantial. So maybe like 40% less, something in that range.
The relative volumes are going to be much less from 12 through
the volumes,
now.
right. So you had huge buildup then. Well, I mean, you already had a lot of buildup of corn ethanol infrastructure prior to that, and then maybe the second half of the buildup right there right after implementation of the RFS. So much less, and we're also partnering with some of those economists to try to explicitly say where there are those spatial impacts, so you can attribute or figure out how much conversion and where was due to the specific policies and changes in that.
And I have a follow-up question on the CARB and the GREET 3 model. Now that's moving from GREET 2, which was, I don't know if you're familiar with CARB.
Yeah, with GREET from Margana.
So what the driver of the new legislation coming in on the West Coast, and then Canada's looking at it too. There's a parity for Quebec. Ontario's looking at it already. British Columbia has something, a quasi CARB type of a program. Alberta is moving into it, and it would have a lot of impact if you can move and shift that ethanol, especially in the low carbon intensity ethanol, into Canada. Did you look at that at all?
No, and we haven't even looked at the land use change in Canada, which would be an interesting component. And we want to. They have similar satellite kind of products where you can look at it, but I mean, I wonder if there's corollaries. I mean, they almost have similar things now where, selling of green credits is a big question about whether you can and then whether or not exports would count for things. Things like Brazil, sugarcane being sometimes qualifies and doesn't for the car.
There was some weird shipping going on.
Right.
Based on the
when you have those international things, everything gets that much more complicated. So our focus for this has really been primarily on U.S. and what is the direct domestic potential land use, and how do you incorporate that? But certainly it's a big integrated market, and you have all these indirect effects tied, coupled.
And with climate change and global warming, as you notice, the Dakotas and the cropland availability is moving north, further north.
Canada could become a bigger player. Sure, who knows? Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for a very nice presentation.
Thanks.
Could you please make comments on water use and the impact of electric vehicles on the transportation sector, and by that correlation, the impact of biofuel standards, and whether we have too much biofuel but not enough demand?
Yeah, so water use, I mean, water use with crops is interesting because it's not, not necessarily consumptive water use. Sometimes you're circulating it back through right in that ecosystem, the evaporation and things. But I do know in general, just for first generation corn ethanol, for that kind of older technology, much greater water use than, say, a petroleum-based fuel. I'm trying to think of the numbers of like a petroleum-based one, something like a liter or like 5 liters of water per liter of fuel, and then on the equivalent of that for a corn-based ethanol, it can really be a huge range based on where it's grown and whether or not it's irrigated. But it could range from, say, that 5 liters of water for a liter of ethanol up to like 150 liters of water for 1 liter of ethanol. So a really big range, but in general, on average, sometimes the crop-based biofuel can be an order of magnitude greater as far as consumptive water use versus petroleum-based product. But again, varies a lot, and that's only then for those first-generation corn-based, ethanol. Something like a cellulosic biofuel, I'm not really sure on that balance, but I would assume much more positive in terms for the, compared to the first generation. So the crops are looking at, reducing the water usage, or crops that are drought tolerant. Grown in areas where you have less rainfall. They're not typically intended to be irrigated, so you have much less water use for that reason as well. So as you look towards the future, I think water use is probably right in the front of the minds of people trying to improve the sustainability of biofuels. I don't know if that answered everything. That's about the extent of my knowledge on it as well. Yeah.
I wonder if you'd make some recommendations for policy changes, and if those would include looking at more dependent variables that affected your policy assumptions that were incorrect with the data that you got, and how if you're going to be looking at more dependent variables that you might have missed.
Like, can you give an example?
Well, like carbon sequestration, or all kinds of other dependent variables that human irrationality that goes into some of the assumptions that the policymakers made.
Yeah. I actually took out a slide I had. So the EPA, when they made that aggregate compliance ruling, they founded it on 5 kind of theories or assumptions at the time, like, increased, demand will not, farmers will not convert land. It will have this. And if you look at them today, I'd say probably at least 3 of those 5 have been proven, incorrect, and 2 of them are maybe questionable. So I do think there's kind of a need to update some of those assumptions that the policies were based off of. And as far as making specific changes, I think aggregate compliance is the one that I always turn to as being a very, would be a good first step. So if you just follow the existing legislation in that language that says crop-based biofuels shouldn't be grown on land converted or cleared after 2007. And if you found a way to implement that, so you could implement that, say, at an ethanol refinery level, where they had to certify that this crop was not grown on converted land, that could not only have benefits for ethanol and corn production, but that could really actually send, I think, ripples throughout the supply chain and for other commodity crops, because that's really the hurdle. I think part of how they came about that aggregate compliance policy was just technical implementation wise. It's really challenging we don't have a chain of custody tracking in the US right now. And so in a sense, just saying, okay, in general, everything's compliant as long as we are pretty good on total cropland area is a way to feasibly do it. If they're short on resources, as EPA is, it's one of the maybe only feasible ways that was available. And that was cited as one of the reasons why they chose that over 2 other possible ways to enforce it. And the other ways were, explicitly making people certify that it was not grown on converted lands, or doing like a coalition approach where you could have like either a third party certifier say, okay, these feedstocks are not grown on ineligible land, or you could have something like a grower group or a organization that represented refiners or producers all come together and do like I think they call it a coalition type certification.
I guess I have two different questions to add on to that. I mean, one is, from the forestry side, doesn't the RFS, or at least the regulation, require that the wood come from like a on-purpose grown plantation? That the trees were planted for the purpose of making biofuels, so that maybe does have some tracking involved in it. And then my second question is just more overall, from your perspective, if like in West Texas, where there isn't anything that grows there, right? Like if you all of a sudden could have a crop like sorghum that doesn't need very much water, or something that's maybe better than sorghum, that could grow there and be a useful thing in a place where they've never been able to grow anything that there was any market for before, is that a bad thing to convert that land into something useful?
Yeah, good question. So the first one, the woody things, I think, so yes, you're right. To the best of my knowledge, the agri compliance is only for crop-based biofuels. And so other pathways like, woody feedstocks have their own whole certification thing. So this is just for those crop-based biofuels. And in that, even in crop-based biofuels, there's actual specific language where it has to be cleared and cultivated prior to 2007 and non-forested. So you can't, so it matches exactly what you're saying. So you can't, right now there is kind of language in which you couldn't clear a forest and plant corn. And then, what about planting something like sorghum in an area where there is no good, economically viable crop? Absolutely. I kind of stay out. I'm pretty, I think, trying to stay open-minded and neutral on all things, even first-generation biofuels, all of them. So I don't have a kind of opinion on good or bad, but absolutely huge. There could be economic benefits of that, right? If it's something that's not irrigated and not, doesn't have a lot of high inputs, it seems like it would certainly have a lot of positives and upsides. Thinking through, the other options, and some of the biofuels could have a great application.
The question is about it sounds like now the research about biofuel is moving from not just fuel, but into more focusing on byproducts like plastics and drugs. And would you tell us some more implication of that transition in terms of energy and environment, etc.?
Yeah, I probably couldn't. I think, you're right. There's a shift towards more of these specialty products. As far as the environmental implications of that, I think it goes, if it's feedstock grown on cropland, then it's probably less, it has the same impact sort of to an extent. Of course, the total life cycle assessment will be different based on all the processing and refining capabilities happening later on, but yeah.
I think the other thing to consider is the sheer volume of the specialty chemicals versus the fuels, and that they're still going to be making much more fuels than chemicals just based on demand, but those chemicals are going to get a much higher profit margin than what you get from fuels. Actually, I have a question regarding kind of the carbon debt, and let's say we start replanting what was converted to corn back to perennials. What sort of how does that reduce that carbon debt sooner, or does it?
Yeah, say that again. So if we plant,
so let's say cropland's been converted to corn, in that let's say 2008 to 2012 period, and now we're planting perennials on there. How does that affect the carbon debts, that payback period?
Yeah, so certainly you can almost look at it as like these cellulosics as having an opportunity for restoration of areas that maybe have been eroded or environmentally sensitive. And okay, if you take it out of an annual crop like corn and now put it into a perennial grass, you could have some real benefits for reducing erosion, probably also for carbon sequestration, because you're putting more into the soil rather than corn. Everything is really, all the carbon is above ground, and you're harvesting that off every year. And of course, it depends tons on the amount of stover that you're leaving on and things like that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for cellulosics to be a potential, like an environmental remediation opportunity. So if you have these spots that are becoming less suitable for traditional crops because of climate change or depleting aquifers, like, hey, here's a really cool opportunity to bring in a drought-resistant crop that doesn't require as many inputs, still gives a nice economic benefit for a farmer or producer, and doesn't have as many of the negative externalities.
Any other questions?
One other, I just popped in my head related to your question of the sorghum in Texas. I think, the other thing is looking at abandoned agricultural land is really a focus too. So, it's hard teetering of, I don't know if it's better if you have a totally native ecosystem. I think a lot of people would say, oh, maybe that's not the best place. You don't want to, plow up and disturb a native habitat or something like that, even if it is for sorghum. But there's so many locations that are underutilized and have been plowed up, sometime in the past. So I think that's one idea, and one thing that we're planning to look on, or look at least within GeoBRC, is trying to identify the spatially explicit map about where abandoned agricultural lands are, and then can you use those spots and these feedstocks to help return economic viability or environmental benefits.
Yeah. One other thing is that when you were talking about policy changes, did you mean really policy or do you mean regulatory? I guess I've just heard people say that they don't think the RFS is ever going to get opened up just because people would think that they couldn't close it again.
Yeah.
That they would never be in agreement, and so they don't want to risk that.
Yeah.
And that it would be more about what you're presenting to the EPA to change their ruling.
I think both are on the table, just from with a little, that we hear over here, not in DC, on the wires, but it seems like right now, there's also this reset rule of when the RFS will expire in 2020 and 2022. And so I know there's probably a lot of administrative and regulatory questions, because then moving forward, it'd be up to EPA to continue implementing it. But leading up to that, there could be legislative action too. And there has been discussions between Cruz in Texas and a lot of the farm state legislatures and legislators in the last couple months, and negotiations about, okay, can we come to a compromise and somehow, give a little bit of this and take a little over here and make everybody happy, from the refiners, the oil refiners, to the ethanol refiners, to the producers and all that. So, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it sounds like, like you say, you'll never be able to touch RFS, and then people are really trying to hold on to it. But then other times it looks like, well, everybody can agree on it, even there's an opportunity. But I think it's not clear whether it would be just administrative or great discussion.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming.